Today, we are diving into what was once called the most haunted house in all of England, Borley Rectory. Now, for decades, this place was the stuff of legend, absolutely filled with stories of spectral nuns, violent poltergeists, and even messages from beyond the grave. But here's the big question. Was it a genuine, absolutely terrifying haunting, or was it one of the most elaborate, clever hoaxes of all time? Well, that's what we're here to figure out.
And that's really the heart of the mystery, isn't it? The story of Borley Rectory has these two completely different sides. On one hand, you have what seems to be the most well-documented haunting in history. And on the other, you've got a masterful deception that might have fooled the entire world. We're going to dig into both sides of that coin.
You know, you'd think the story of a haunted house would start when the house was actually built, right? In this case, 1863. But no. The story of Borley's haunting starts way before that, with this dark, local legend from the Middle Ages that really set the stage for everything that was to come.
So this is the origin story, the tragic tale that kicks everything off. A classic forbidden love affair that ends in the most gruesome way possible. Now here's the interesting part. There's actually no historical proof that a monastery or a convent even existed in the area. But it didn't matter. This legend became this incredibly powerful lens through which every single strange thing that happened at Borley would be seen for the next 100 years.
Okay, to really get what's going on here, you've got to follow the timeline of who lived in this house. It all starts with the Bull family. They built the place and stuck around for over 60 years. Then you get the Smiths, who, well, they only lasted a couple of years. They're followed by the Foysters, and that's when things really escalate. And that leads us straight to the famous investigator Harry Price, all before the whole place dramatically burns to the ground in 1939. You see, each family added a new and somehow more intense chapter to the story.
So the house is built for the Reverend Henry Bull and his, get this, 14 children. And almost immediately things start getting weird. From the very beginning, this was not a quiet country home.
For over 60 years, the Bull family's experiences really laid the groundwork for the whole legend. That ghostly nun became such a regular sight, they actually nicknamed a path in their garden the Nun's Walk. They even built a summer house just so they could sit and watch for her. Can you imagine? And it wasn't just the nun. They reported phantom coaches, footsteps when no one was there, strange whispers. And then there's this chilling little detail. Reverend Henry Bull died in a specific bedroom, the Blue Room, and years later, his son Harry, who took over for him, died in that exact same room.
So after the last of the Bulls moved out, the house sat empty for a year. Then, in come Reverend Guy Smith and his wife. And you can imagine them hearing the local gossip and just brushing it off. Well, they found out pretty quickly that these weren't just stories. The servant bells would start ringing like crazy, even after they cut the wires. Footsteps would pace the halls at night. It was constant.
The Smiths got so freaked out that they did something pretty unusual for the time. They reached out to the Daily Mirror newspaper for help. And let me tell you, that was the moment Borley Rectory went from a creepy local legend to a full-blown national sensation. And all that attention brought a very famous investigator knocking on their door.
And of course, the newspaper brought in the biggest name in the paranormal world at the time, Harry Price. He was charismatic, a bit of a showman, and yeah, some would say he was pretty hungry for the spotlight. His arrival was about to change everything.
So Price shows up, and on his very first visit, boom, the house supposedly puts on a show. Pebbles are being thrown. A candlestick gets hurled down the stairs. They even hold a seance in the Blue Room and claim they made contact with the spirit of the recently deceased Harry Bull. Just like that, Price's involvement cemented Borley's fame. But, believe it or not, the most extreme activity was still to come.
When the next residents moved in, Reverend Lionel Foyster, his young wife Mary Ann, and their daughter, the activity just exploded. Harry Price himself estimated that over 2,000 separate paranormal incidents happened during their 5 years there, and a huge chunk of those phenomena seemed to center, maybe suspiciously, around Mary Ann.
And we're not talking about subtle stuff anymore. This was disturbingly violent. Objects were hurled across rooms every day. Messages like, "Mary Ann, please help, get," would just appear on the walls. Mary Ann even claimed she was repeatedly and physically thrown out of her bed by some unseen force. It was this intense escalation that convinced Harry Price he needed to do something more serious, more scientific.
So after the Foysters finally had enough and left, Price made a really bold move. He leased the empty rectory for a whole year. He put an ad in the Times newspaper and recruited a team of 48 observers to basically conduct a round-the-clock stakeout. It was during one of their seances that a spirit, calling itself Sunex Amuris, came through with this absolutely chilling prediction. The rectory was going to burn down that very night. Now it didn't, but almost exactly 1 year later, in February 1939, Borley Rectory was completely destroyed in a fire.
Well, after Harry Price died, critics started picking his investigation apart, accusing him of exaggerating evidence, maybe even faking some of it. But the most shocking twist, the biggest bombshell of all, didn't come from a skeptical researcher. It came from someone who claimed he'd lived in the house and that he'd perpetrated the whole hoax himself.
Yep.
In the year 2000, a man named Louis Mehrling published a book with a very bold title, We Faked the Ghosts of Borley Rectory. In it, he claimed that he, along with members of the Bull and Foister families, had staged many of the most famous events. He basically said it was all just an elaborate, long-running prank that completely spiraled out of control.
And he seemed to have a simple, rational explanation for almost everything. Those ghostly bells that rang on their own, he said they just poked them with a stick through a window. The spooky writing that vanished from the walls, just a trick of the cheap plaster they used. It absorbed the ink. Those terrifying poltergeist knocks, turns out it was just a new, really noisy water heater. According to him, the whole thing was a game.
So here's the thing. If you have such a detailed confession from an insider, that should be case closed, right? So why on earth are we still talking about Borley Rectory? Why didn't the legend just die right then and there?
Because, and this is where the story takes another crazy turn, buried deep within his detailed confession of a total hoax, Mehrling describes one terrifying event that he claims was absolutely 100% real, an event so profound he said it left him partially blind.
He describes being at a séance in the rectory's cellar in 1935 with Marianne Foister and some pretty distinguished guests, including the playwright George Bernard Shaw. And he says that out of nowhere, there was this blinding flash of silver blue light that just erupted from the walls, causing an instant paralysis in everyone there. The very same man who claimed it was all a farce described an event that left him terrified and, he claimed, permanently injured. And that right there is the enduring mystery of Borley Rectory. Even with a confession on the table, there are these pieces that just don't fit. The house is long gone, completely leveled after the fire, but its story remains. And it forces you to ask a really interesting question. What's more powerful in the end? An actual ghost? Or just a perfectly crafted ghost story that became so compelling even its own creators couldn't fully escape it?